Nicole Brown was 18 years old, working as a waitress at a private club in Beverly Hills when she met her soon-to-be husband, famous football player OJ Simpson. OJ was over 10 years older than her and at the time married to his first wife when they began seeing each other. OJ divorced his first wife and married Nicole Brown in 1985. During the marriage, OJ was alleged to be physically abusive, with Nicole reporting OJ to the police multiple times, including one time in which he was arrested and pled no contest to spousal abuse. They eventually divorced after 7 years of marriage, but made attempts to reconcile afterward, at which point the abuse continued, and Nicole had made calls to police suggesting that she may have feared for her life. Brown finally called the relationship off sometime in 1994 and moved out of their shared home. Later, on June 12th of that year, Nicole was found dead. She had been stabbed to death outside of her home along with a man, a young waiter named Ron Goldman. For Ron and for Nicole, this would be where the story would end. For the majority of the public, this would be where the bigger story began. The police attempted to reach OJ at his home to notify him of the murder, but found blood on his door and decided to enter his home thinking someone inside might be injured. Inside, they found a right-handed glove that was blood-stained and matched a left-handed glove found next to Goldman's body. OJ had been in Chicago at the time that they came to his house. When he returned, they brought him in for questioning and noticed that he had a cut on his left hand consistent with the bloody left-hand glove that was found at the murder scene. They sampled his blood to see if it matched the blood at the crime scene and found it to be a match. OJ spent the night with Robert Kardashian, a lawyer who was a close friend of OJ's, and would end up serving as one of his many lawyers during the trial. His then lawyer, Robert Shapiro, was contacted and informed that OJ would have to turn himself in as a suspect in the murder of Nicole Brown. He did not turn himself in and instead had fled. He wrote a letter that was read by Kardashian to the public, with the popular consensus among the public and people close to OJ being that the letter was intended as a suicide note. The police received reports of OJ attempting to flee in a white Bronco that belonged to his friend and former NFL star Al Cowlings. They found him on the 405 freeway in the backseat of the car with a gun to his head, threatening to kill himself. This resulted in a low-speed pursuit that lasted for 3 hours. The chase was televised the entire time, with the televised pursuit of OJ capturing the attention of the nation and going on to be one of the most viewed television events in broadcasting history. Cowlings, who was driving the car, drove them to OJ's house, where OJ stayed inside the Bronco for nearly an hour before he finally surrendered to authorities. Police allowed him to wait in his house for another hour for Shapiro to arrive. The police found inside the Bronco a number of materials suggesting the possibility that OJ intended to flee the country, including a passport, a disguise, almost $9,000 in cash, and a gun. OJ pleaded not guilty to the murders of Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman. A trial was held, and like the chase before it, the trial of OJ Simpson would be televised. People across the country and even the world would tune in to see what would happen. They would witness in real time as OJ and his team of lawyers scrambled to try whatever they could to prove OJ's innocence. They could hear of the murder of Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman in all its brutal detail. For people tuning in, it took on an almost soap opera or TV drama-esque quality, in which people could learn and thus felt an irresistible urge to learn of the intimate, disturbing, and violent details about the murders and, if OJ was found guilty, about the guy who murdered them. There were ultimately 2 verdicts possible, and thus, among the water cooler discussions of the OJ trial, there were 2 competing narratives about OJ and the murder of Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman. Either OJ was guilty of murder, or he was innocent. Regardless of what side a person landed on, they could have dozens, if not hundreds of reasons to support their belief on the matter. Consequently, to the public eye, there were effectively 2 OJs, guilty OJ and innocent OJ. Neither of these people were or are the real OJ, but instead, they're cultural narratives, a sort of semi-fictional character that we as society construct when viewing OJ through the lens of the parasocial dynamic of television. Whether or not OJ actually killed Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman is rendered beside the point in this cultural process. Once viewing OJ as guilty, or alternatively as innocent, we create an idea of OJ that we project this guilt or innocence onto. These 2 ideas of who OJ is are 2 very different people. In the case of his innocence, he was wrongly framed for the murder of his ex-wife who he dearly loved. In the case of his guilt, he was a jealous and vindictive man who brutally murdered an ex-wife he suspected of being with another man. OJ was eventually found not guilty of the murders. He was a free man. For some, this was a good thing, and for others, it was a very, very bad thing. While the verdict of the criminal court trial was that OJ was innocent, many still hold to the belief that he was guilty and was falsely let go. Does the innocent verdict mean that OJ was actually innocent the whole time? Well, not necessarily. He was later sued by Brown's father and taken to civil court, where the civil court found OJ liable for the murders, and he was ordered to pay $33 million in damages to the families of the victims. Does this mean he killed them? Legally, it's a gray area. Personally, I do think he did it based on the evidence that's available to the public, based on the civil court verdict, and it's by far the more popular opinion, with the statistics showing that among Americans polled, 71% believed he was guilty of the murders as of 2017, over 20 years after the fact. This video isn't ultimately about OJ, but discussing him is necessary for understanding the topic of today's video. There's a lot I've left out, such as the racialized elements of the trial. OJ was a black man on trial for killing a white woman. There's the fact that the trial occurred shortly after the trial for the police who assaulted Rodney King, where they were acquitted. The Rodney King verdict led to riots, which meant that there was a developing generalized anxiety that arresting a famous and beloved black sports figure such as OJ would be a disaster as far as race relations and general public opinion. At the time, a large number of black Americans viewed OJ as innocent, and after the intensely controversial Rodney King verdict, there was a lot of pressure to evade further controversy with the OJ trial. So why am I talking so much about the OJ murder trial? I'm sure many know, but for those who don't, the OJ Simpson murder trial was one of the major sources of inspiration behind David Lynch's Lost Highway. This video is the fifth in a series of videos I'm doing about the original works of David Lynch. Previous videos on Eraserhead, Blue Velvet, the Twin Peaks original series, and Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me can be found on my channel. This series covers Lynch's work using through lines of feminist theory and postmodern theory that help to understand Lynch's art as expressing various ideas about American culture and the various political, social, cultural, and often spiritual and interpersonal issues that endanger America's basic state of affairs. Lost Highway was, at the time of its release, maligned as a lesser work of his, performing poorly at the box office and reviewing poorly. It has since, in subsequent decades, been reappraised as not only one of his best films, but also for some as a masterpiece of late 20th century American filmmaking. I'm not making this video to explain Lost Highway or to help you understand it, but just to share what the film means to me as an individual work and when taken in the context of Lynch's broader career. Making sense of Lost Highway, in my opinion, requires making sense of the OJ case and various aspects of it. Lynch himself spoke of there being two OJs who existed simultaneously in one man, where Lynch watched the trial and could see him simultaneously as the cheery OJ that the public knew and loved, and as a potential violent murderer and domestic abuser. This concept of two OJs was the basis for Lost Highway's basic plot and a lot of its themes, but I would say there are more details about the OJ trial that are important to Lost Highway. So before I talk about Lost Highway's themes in full, I want to talk about the ways in which Lost Highway references the OJ trial or mirrors cultural themes that emerge from it. At this point in the video, there will be major spoilers for Lost Highway down to very fine details. Please consider watching the movie beforehand if you haven't, because it really is a film worth seeing without knowing everything that happens in it. It is, for me, the Lynch film that was most exciting to watch for the first time because of a number of twists and turns and interesting stylistic choices that I didn't expect and that I was really enthralled by. So please go watch it. And for those who've seen it, let's begin. Lost Highway parallels the OJ Simpson trial in a number of ways. So first, let's recap the plot. Lost Highway concerns the story of a man named Fred, a saxophone player in Los Angeles. Fred overhears on the intercom outside his home that a man named Dick Laurent is dead. Seemingly the next day, Fred's wife Renee discovers a videotape on their front porch. Fred demands that they watch the tape, only to find that the tape appears to be someone stalking their home and filming it. More tapes arrive over the course of the next several days, causing Fred to become increasingly angry and paranoid. A second tape reveals that the stalker has entered their home and was filming them while they slept. A third and final tape enters their bedroom again to find Fred covered in blood and in some state of delirium while kneeling over the mangled corpse of Renee. Fred is sentenced to death after being found guilty of the murder of Renee. We find Fred in prison, refusing to believe that he was guilty of the crime, and seemingly in a state of great distress, with a number of physical health concerns that doctors can't seem to diagnose. One day, a guard checks the cells of all of the prisoners, only to find that Fred has somehow disappeared entirely, with some other man, a young man named Pete, in his place. Pete has no recollection of how he got there, has no relationship to Fred whatsoever, and is thus set free. The film has 3 distinct sections. The first and final sections of the film concern Fred, while the second section concerns Pete. We'll call them Fred's story and Pete's story. Pete's story begins with him as a mechanic, fixing the car of a local mob boss named Mr. Eddie. Pete one day meets Mr. Eddie's girlfriend, Alice. It's worth noting at this point that Alice is played by Patricia Arquette, the same actress as Renee, and appears to potentially be the same person, albeit with the primary difference being her hair color and style. The two also have somewhat different personalities, although Renee's personality is not very pronounced in the first act of the film. Pete begins to sleep with Alice behind Mr. Eddie's back over and over again at Alice's insistence. Mr. Eddie begins to suspect that Pete is having an affair with Alice and threatens his life multiple times. Alice decides to meet with Pete, having devised a plan to have Pete help her break free from Mr. Eddie's control so that they can run away together. The plan goes like this. Pete has to knock out one of Mr. Eddie's friends, Andy, a man who we saw earlier in Fred's story as someone that Renee knows. Once he knocks Andy out, they can steal his car and some money. Alice sleeps with Andy to distract him, and then Pete attempts to knock Andy out, although a brief scuffle ensues and Andy is accidentally killed in the process. Pete and Alice take the money and leave to a cabin in the desert where they intend to wait for a man who will give them the belongings they need in order to flee the country. Pete and Alice's story has no resolution to their escape plan. Instead, while waiting for the man to arrive, Pete and Alice have sex. Alice asks Pete if he wants her. He says over and over again, "I want you." Alice then says, "You'll never have me," before getting up in the middle of having sex, walking away, and then being nowhere to be found. A man gets up from where Pete was lying. It's Fred. Fred's story continues, but from a different place than it started. We see Fred go to a nearby hotel where he finds Renee sleeping with a man named Dick Laurent, who looks just like Mr. Eddie. We know they're the same person because when detectives followed Pete and saw Mr. Eddie, they identified him as Dick Laurent. Fred waits for Renee to leave and then apprehends Laurent, shoving him into the trunk of his car and driving him out into the middle of the desert. While out in the middle of the desert, Fred and an accomplice known only as the Mystery Man kill Laurent. Fred drives home, goes to his intercom, and announces that Dick Laurent is dead. Fred then drives away as police pursue him, only to seem to die in his car through some strange supernatural circumstance. I wanted to recap some of the basics to help make sense of the connections to the OJ trial. Immediately, a number of similarities stand out. Fred's wife being found brutally murdered with significant evidence suggesting it was Fred mirrors OJ's wife being found brutally murdered with evidence pointing to him. As well, we don't ever see the act of the murder, nor does anyone in the film see it happen, just as in real life there were no confirmed witnesses or recordings of the murder who could necessarily identify who had actually done it. Fred appears to be overly possessive of Renee and suspects her of cheating, which becomes the motivation for his killing Dick Laurent. This resembles the narrative about Guilty OJ, in which he killed Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman because of suspecting the two of sleeping together, suggesting that Guilty OJ had an intensely possessive view of Nicole. Fred and Pete having some sort of narrative or even spiritual connection mirrors the two OJs, with Fred being similar in the narrative to Guilty OJ, and Pete being more similar to Innocent OJ. Pete is surrounded by violence, but he is ultimately innocent of it. He didn't kill Andy. Andy's death just coincided with Pete's attempt to help Alice escape a bad situation. Pete loves Alice and is trying to help her break free from a man who is a threat to her life. One could make similar cases of Innocent OJ, that the deaths surrounding him were coincidence, that OJ was in love with Nicole and would not have it in him to murder someone. Lastly, the other more obvious parallel is the final police pursuit of the film, very much mirroring that of the white Bronco chase of OJ that was televised. But there are more subtle or vague details that connect the two. For example, the prominence of videotapes and recordings of people's lives relates heavily to OJ's televised trial and pursuit. Just as the videotapes are stalking Fred's house, going so far as to break in on their private affairs and find intimate details about their private lives, so too did the trial both visually and culturally reveal a lot of truths about OJ and the life and death of Nicole Brown, including their domestic life and some of the uncomfortable truths contained within it. Another subtle detail is how the mystery man, who in the third act becomes an accomplice to Fred, mirrors the various people involved in helping obscure the possibility of OJ's guilt, particularly Al Callings, as well as the various lawyers who both represented him and were involved in his attempt to evade arrest. We see, for example, that the mystery man is the one who hands Fred a knife that he uses to slit Laurent's throat, and then the mystery man himself is the one who pulls the trigger on the pistol that kills Laurent with a shot to the head. So did Fred kill Laurent? In the quote-unquote canon of Lost Highway, no, he didn't. The mystery man is not necessarily a real person in the story. He's an abstraction, a literalized version of a narrative idea. Within that abstraction, the mystery man's violence can be believed to be Fred's violence just as easily as otherwise. His presence obscures Fred's potentially guilty nature, just as a number of men surrounding OJ did in real life. There's one last similarity that, in my opinion, will be the most important to Lost Highway, and is also important when discussing the OJ trial generally, which is why I needed to start with this much preamble. Nicole Brown was a human being. She was a woman who, at one point, loved OJ, married him, and had children with him. At some point, she had been abused by OJ to such a degree that she may have feared for her life. She attempted to break free from his control by divorcing him, but decided to reconcile. Shortly after reconciling, she attempted to separate again, and this was when she was found dead. If we accept the idea that OJ is guilty, then it would be the case that Nicole's last moments would involve being brutally murdered by someone who she used to love. She doesn't get privacy or subjectivity or humanity in her story. In her story, she was a victim of a much more famous and powerful man's alleged wrath. And while she didn't get those things in her life, in death, her humanity was stripped even further from her by the press, by the cultural reaction to the news of her killing, and of course, by the killing itself. How you feel about OJ will, to some degree, reflect how you feel about Nicole. If you believe him guilty, you believe her to be the wronged wife of a cruel, violent man. If you believe him innocent, then you might also be compelled to deny the domestic abuse that she had claimed, or that she had reasons to fear for her life before her murder because of OJ's violent tendencies. Whether or not you think she died by his hand will tell you a lot about how you feel about how she, and indeed, how they, lived. But in her life story, she is always the victim of a brutal murder. She doesn't get to tell her side of the story because she's dead. So when the trial occurred, we got to see OJ's side of the story, but not hers. He had power, he had subjectivity, his voice was heard. Hers was not. If we view the two OJs as competing narratives about a man who potentially murdered his wife, then we can also view there to be competing narratives between OJ's story and Nicole's. But since we don't get to hear from Nicole, only from OJ, then we're perceiving Nicole with 1 degree of separation. We're seeing Nicole's story from the perspective of OJ. He controls a lot about how we feel about the life that they live together, which will then inform whether we see him as innocent or guilty. It is often the case with domestic abuse that domestic abusers will isolate their victims to make the abuse possible without repercussion. The victim will often not speak out for some reason or another, with 2 prominent reasons being love of the abuser and also fear of consequences. When the victim does speak out, the abuser will often retaliate or escalate in some way, both to punish the victim, viewing said punishment as the righteous response to what the abuser believes is unfair treatment, and also to control the dynamic so that the victim will not be able to further out the abuser as abusive. In order to keep the victim under the abuser's control, the abuser will do increasingly drastic things if they believe it to be necessary or justified. This means that until the domestic abuse victim speaks out, the abuser will often control the narrative about their relationship and about what has happened to said victim. When the victim speaks out, the abuser will attempt to keep control or regain control of the narrative for a number of reasons. Depending on how upset the abuser is or how drastic they perceive the circumstances to be, one of the ultimate forms of advantage for an abuser to get away with their abuse is to make it impossible for the victim to speak out. Many domestic abuse cases end in murder for this reason, among others. Abusers will kill their spouses, with one benefit of doing so being that the victim will no longer be able to speak out or be heard. In this situation, the dream come true for an abuser would be to silence the victim permanently and get away with it. As well, this would also be viewed by the abuser as a form of justice, perceiving the victim's actions as harmful and thus deserving of punishment. If we look at guilty OJ, we could see how amazingly beneficial it would be to be found innocent of the killings and face no repercussions for having killed his wife and her lover. It means that he has the ultimate control over her life, her story, and her subjectivity. He got to control her, he got to effectively own her, and nobody will ever know the truth because he successfully buried it. That is, if we accept that he really was guilty. Yes, there was, to the public eye, 2 OJs, but there was also 2 OJs to Nicole Brown. Many domestic abuse victims have to contend with both loving and fearing their intimate partners, because the partner is capable of such joy and such pain. Both are a necessary part of the cycle of abuse. Many victims have difficulty leaving because they love their partner and see them in this positive light, but then have to see their partners do horrible, upsetting, and even cruel things. They have to watch their partner change before their eyes, watch the person they love do things they wouldn't condone from anyone else, things that disturb them, that traumatize and harm them. Most of the time, before abuse victims speak out, everyone else sees the abuser in a positive light, because abusers often control the narrative about their relationship by appearing sympathetic to outsiders and obscuring the dark truths within the relationship. So within domestic abuse cases, there are 2 versions of the abuser. There's the side that everyone loves and the cruel side, and the victims often have to see both sides at the same time and contend with the seemingly contradictory nature. Oftentimes, victims are unable to reconcile it, even well after leaving their partner. They're left confused and sometimes incapable of understanding why the person did what they did or was the way they were. Nicole Brown lived and died seeing 2 sides of OJ. But when the trial ensued, the darker side of OJ was all hypothetical to everyone but her. Her perspective was not on display. Thus, we had to decide for ourselves whether to be sympathetic to her side or his, while not having access to her side in the first place. We had to decide how to process who Nicole Brown was, how she really felt, and what really happened to her through the lens of her abuser. This aspect of the OJ trial is the most crucial piece of information relevant to Lost Highway. Renee and Alice are domestic abuse victims. Renee does not get subjectivity in her life or death. We see the film framed primarily from the perspectives of Fred and later Pete. We see how they feel. We see their rationale. We see their perspective. We see Renee and Alice not as they are subjectively, but as objects of interest for the men in their lives. The film itself deprives Renee and Alice of humanity, the way that Nicole Brown was deprived of humanity by the media frenzy surrounding her death. Renee and Alice exist in the narrative Lost Highway with 1 degree of separation. Their actions, their motives, their natures being filtered through the perspectives of Fred and Pete. But while this could be read as misogynistic to deprive them of such power in the narrative, I have a different read. The film depriving them of power in the framing of the narrative helps us make sense of the OJ trial and of domestic abuse more broadly. See, even though we didn't get to hear from Nicole Brown and often don't get to hear from domestic abuse survivors except filtered through the lens of their abusers, there is still a truth of abuse that exists within these stories, even with their manipulative framing. The truth of domestic abuse is still revealed by the OJ trial, as is the case with many domestic abuse survivors. Narrative control can't destroy truth, but can only obscure it. When abusers attempt to control the narratives about their victims, they have to be selective in how they do so in order to be able to obscure the fact of their abuse. But you don't need to hear the victim's perspective to discover the truth of the abuse. You should hear the victim's perspective whenever possible, but there is one important first step long before hearing the victim's perspective that we as people need to do, which is to ready ourselves to be capable of believing the truth of abuse when it happens. Not all cases of domestic abuse are men abusing women, and what I'm about to say applies to other cases of domestic abuse too, but I'm going to gender my statements for the sake of this video, because in the case of OJ and in the case of Lost Highway, the situation concerns men abusing women. In cases where the abuser is a man and the victim is a woman, there will likely be a cultural tendency to believe the abuser over the victim because of the abuser being a man and the victim being a woman. This is because of misogynistic norms in our society that say that women are exploiting men when accusing them of wrongdoing, either for money or for fame, or because the woman is abusive or selfish in some way or another. These misogynistic norms inform why abusers engage in abuse in the first place, but also informs why we tend not to believe women when they speak out about being abused, because patriarchal cultural values in society view women as effectively the property of men. We live in the 21st century and women are not treated literally as property anymore, but culturally we still tend to see men as subject and women as object. Thus, in relationships, we view the men as having more subjectivity than the women. Women are supposed to be beautiful, sexually desirable, and subservient to the desires of men. Women exist to uphold men, to support men, to follow the leadership of their male partners, etc. These patriarchal norms are very old but became rigidly enforced in America in a new way in the 1950s as a response to the shift in labor relations between men and women during World War II. We broke away from those norms in the 1960s as women pushed for more rights in the second and later third wave of feminism, but this brought with it a lot of resentment from men who held patriarchal values, which led to some men desiring more than ever to reduce women to a state of helplessness that requires the patriarchal control by their male partners. This cultural shift was the basis for the storytelling in Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, as well as Lynch's own Blue Velvet. So before we listen to women who are victims of domestic abuse, we need to first be willing to believe that men who we otherwise think are innocent might be capable of cruelty that we have just not yet been exposed to. Before we can hear women's side of the story, we need to be capable of doing so. And once we are willing to believe that men are capable of misogynistic values and misogynistic acts, then we can discover the truths of domestic abuse when they occur, even in circumstances where the woman has somehow been silenced. And like I said, we really should hear women's side of the story always, but it's just as important, in my opinion, to tackle what abuse looks like and what the abuser mindset looks like. In order to be capable of granting women subjectivity, we have to identify the ways in which they are being objectified, the ways in which they are being denied autonomy, the ways in which they are being denied humanity. We have to identify misogynistic values, actions, and biases in men and in society generally. And once we do that, we can see truths of domestic abuse from a mile away, and then we can try to give back some humanity to those who have lost it. Nicole Brown died without her side being shared, but in the absence of her word, we can still look at OJ and his history with Nicole Brown and identify ways in which OJ very well reflected the ideologies of misogyny and patriarchy that would suggest that he either had been, or would likely have been, abusive towards her. Now, with all of that out of the way, here's my primary thesis on Lost Highway. Renee and Alice are both victims of domestic abuse and misogynistic exploitation. Renee is being abused by Fred, and Alice is being abused, initially by Mr. Eddie. But by the end of Pete's story, it will become apparent through close enough examination that Pete is also abusive, or at the very least, highly possessive of Alice, and will consequently likely end up becoming abusive if Alice doesn't eventually leave him. Fred and Pete are two competing narratives about possessive men. At a first glance, we can view Fred as guilty and Pete as innocent, but this is a false dichotomy. Both of them are guilty of the same ideologies of abuse, patriarchy, and misogyny as each other, and both of them are innocent in that they both believe themselves to be innocent. The only reason a viewer might view Pete as uniquely innocent is because the narrative of the film grants him subjectivity over Alice and frames Alice from his perspective, suggesting she is manipulative and self-centered. But even if we accept at face value that everything we see happening in Pete and Alice's story is factual, we can still, from these facts, discern that Pete is not a good person, is exploiting Alice, and that Alice's escape from both Mr. Eddie and Pete is necessary for her own survival, well-being, and humanity. Alice escaping Pete is a good thing. It is the embodiment of Pete's worst fears, which are also Fred's worst fears. Fred fears that Renee has autonomy, that Renee does not solely belong to him, that she is a human being capable of leaving him and does not owe him her body, her mind, and her life. Fred's fear of this truth is the impetus for him killing Dick Laurent and Renee, that deprived Renee of the chance to do what Alice did, to escape. Lost Highway is, at its core, a story about domestic abuse victims and their abusers, and more specifically, how abusive men attempt to gain control over the narrative of their abuse in order to prevent the woman from escaping, speaking out, or revealing the cruelty of their actions. The core message of Lost Highway is that the truth of their abuse will be revealed eventually, giving some sense of cosmic justice back to women who are victims of abuse either after they escape or, in more severe and tragic circumstances, posthumously after they've been killed. There is no goodness, no bright side to domestic abuse. But Lost Highway goes to some length to acknowledge that no matter how severe abuse gets, or how much cultural control over the narratives of their lives happens, women in abusive situations still have humanity, and that humanity can't be stripped of them in life or in death. Lost Highway begins, like many of Lynch's works, with the sparking of a mystery. A voice is heard over the intercom at Fred's apartment. Dick Laurent is dead. This early in the film, we have no idea who Dick Laurent is, nor who is delivering the message. By the end of the film, both will be known. What we need to know for now is that Dick Laurent is a man who appears to be involved in the porn industry and is sleeping with Renee Madison, behind her husband, Fred's back. Fred is a jealous and possessive man. He is controlling of Renee, and throughout the film we find evidence to suggest that he suspects her of cheating. But since his story is told out of order, let's place it into the correct order so that we can understand his character better. Renee is a porn actress. It's not made explicit in the film whether or not Fred knows this and whether or not Renee knows that Fred knows this. But regardless, her role in porn has led to an affair with the producer of said porn, a man named Dick Laurent. Fred at some point becomes suspicious of Renee and stalks her to discover if she's been having an affair. He finds her cheating on him with Dick Laurent in a hotel in the desert, but doesn't alert her to his presence. She leaves the hotel, at which point Fred attacks Laurent and drives him out to the desert in the trunk of his car. Fred reveals to Dick that he knows about the affair and that he knows about the pornography that they make together. If we assume that the mystery man is an abstraction, then we can interpret the scene as Fred killing Dick Laurent. Alternatively, if we keep the mystery man as a literal character, then we know that Fred is an accomplice to Dick's murder. The ambiguity is intentional, but we have to consider that even in the ambiguity, it can be certain that Fred acted with malicious intent and wanted Laurent dead. This all seems to happen prior to the first act of the film, with the final act of the film being a flashback of sorts. We then cut ahead in time and see that Fred and Renee live a joyless, loveless life together. Renee discovers a package containing a videotape on their doorstep. Fred makes them watch the tape together, and they discover that they are being stalked by some unknown person with a video camera, who at this point chronologically has already been revealed to be the mystery man. Fred can't sleep with Renee without seeing the face of the mystery man and becoming overwhelmed with negative emotions. He knows something is wrong. And we know something is very wrong in their relationship. At this point, Fred has found Renee out and murdered her secret lover. Renee seems intent on hiding the videotape that she finds before Fred forces them to watch it together. It's likely that Renee expected it to be the pornography that she shot with Laurent and doesn't want Fred to see it. This may suggest that Renee never told Fred about her sex work or any level of relationship to Laurent. My interpretation of Fred forcing them to watch the tapes together is that Fred is trying to catch Renee in the act of the affair with concrete proof that gives him an out for explaining why he eventually will harm her for what she's done. He wants to punish her in some way, maybe not explicitly murder yet, but given he's killed Laurent, it seems an inevitable escalation. He just needs the internal go-ahead to do it by framing himself as the victim when he discovers she's been cheating on him in a way that doesn't immediately indicate that he's been stalking her all along and has already killed Laurent. This, from very early on, establishes that Fred is an abuser. We see by the end of the film that Fred, throughout, is controlling, suspicious, jealous, vindictive, violent, and vengeful. We know that Fred has it in him to kill someone and could possibly kill Renee. It should be apparent that Renee is not safe with Fred by the end of the film, but we don't even need to get to the third act or even the murder scene of Renee to find plenty of evidence of Fred having the seed of violent control that marks domestic abuse and that would eventually lead to her death. I use the seed planting image intentionally. Lynch himself has used this metaphor in several works. Twin Peaks has the golden beads, Blue Velvet has the ear in the lot, and Eraserhead has a strange object I've only ever been able to refer to as the seed for lack of a better description. In that film, the seed hinted at the growing desire for infidelity and abandonment of fatherly duties for Henry. It was only when the seed bloomed to its fullest form that we, from the eye of the camera, entered into it and saw Henry cheat on his wife and betray his family. While I don't think every instance of a mysterious object in Lynch's work makes sense to call a seed, I see Eraserhead as setting a precedent about certain objects being imbued with a meaning indicating some kind of growth, be that literal or in a more psychological or emotional sense. The videotapes function, like the ear in the grass lot or like the seed in Eraserhead, as planting in the Madisons the growing reality that Fred will soon murder Renee. I don't think it's coincidence that Fred and Renee both expect the tapes to be porn that features Renee. I think that there's a connection being drawn between the tapes we actually see and the tapes they expect to be seeing. After all, the tapes are visuals that tell us that someone or something has disrupted their domestic life. Something has invaded them in their most intimate and vulnerable state, watching them in bed. This is, to me, an obvious analog to what the role of porn has had in their relationship. It's created in Renee a sense of paranoia of the wrath of Fred if he finds out, and has created in Fred an anger that will grow more and more towards a cruel and fatal intent. I don't believe that it's porn that ruined their relationship. Far from it. Their relationship has been ruined primarily by Fred already, and the porn is simply going to be the boiling point that turns a bad relationship into a dangerous one. At this point in the story, it already has. The videotapes, then, take on this meaning of both causing disruption in their relationship, but also revealing it. The videotapes reveal a dark truth by the simple act of intrusion. Their home life is no longer safe, and while it would be easy to say that this is due to outside forces, it's apparent through the course of the narrative that it was invited in by Fred himself. There's something to understand about abuse. Abuse is never justified. Regardless of the ethics of the actions of one person in a relationship, that person does not deserve to be assaulted, psychologically harmed, or killed. We don't really know Renee in Lost Highway. We learn very little about her, but within what we do know, there's a spectrum of possibilities. It's fully possible that Renee is a victim of sex trafficking. It's also possible that she got into sex work to make ends meet to support her and Fred's life in LA, and help support his dreams of being a saxophone player, and that her relationship with Laurent is purely business and she loves Fred. It's also possible that she just is cheating on Fred, that she doesn't love Fred and wants to leave him. It's possible that she's doing this because she's deeply afraid of Fred and that Fred has a history of domestic abuse and Renee is trying to get away from him. It's also possible that she just thinks Fred is a terrible partner or that she's even cheating despite him. There are so many possibilities as to why Renee does what she does, but importantly, while she may be betraying Fred's trust, she does not deserve to be killed for anything she's done. There can't be an equivalence made between Renee's unfaithfulness and Fred's controlling and violent acts, but the key to domestic abuse is that it justifies itself in such a way, that Renee's actions are fundamentally worse or equivalent to Fred's, thus allowing Fred the supposed right to kill her. The second videotape arrives, showing that someone has been filming them sleep. This causes Fred and Renee to panic and reach out to the police. Some detectives arrive, and they ask if either of them have a video camera. We learn in this moment that Fred refuses to allow them to have video cameras because he hates them, explaining,
"I like to remember things my own way, how I remembered them, not necessarily the way they happened."
This is, to me, the biggest sign that Fred is a domestic abuser. It suggests he has a willingness to gaslight by forcing Renee to live by Fred's version of events by depriving her of options for an objective account of how things happen. There's so much to be said about Fred's suspicion of video cameras. For starters, cameras would reveal his violent and abusive tendencies, so it's possible he wants to remove the chance of being found out to be violent. Then there's the narrative control aspect, being able to control how people perceive him by forbidding access to a second-hand account of how he behaves, particularly around Renee. Then there's the fact that Renee is a porn actress. He might have a general distaste for movie cameras because he's disgusted by Renee's work and doesn't want to be reminded of it. There are many possibilities, but what matters is that they don't have a video camera because of Fred, and not as a mutual decision or because of a mutual agreement. Fred controls their lives, and in the first act, it's mostly in subtle ways. It doesn't stay subtle, however. Through the first act of the film, Fred becomes increasingly paranoid. A bad encounter with the mystery man deeply worries him, at which point he accidentally reveals to Renee's friend Andy that he knows that Dick Laurent is dead. In fact, he wouldn't have known at this point unless he was responsible for killing him. Andy becomes suspicious of Fred because there's no reason Fred should know this info already. Fred then takes out his paranoia on Renee, chastising her for being friends with Andy. Andy will later be found dead, and although all signs in the film point to him dying at the hands of Pete, it's up to the viewer to decide if this death is tied to Fred's story in some way or not. Fred's paranoia reaches an all-time high when he sees lights being manipulated inside his house, suggesting that someone has broken in. He goes in, making Renee wait outside, expecting to have to fight with someone. He finds nobody. Either it was all in his head, or someone broke in and left before Fred could catch them. There are two people it could be. Either the stalker who has been videotaping them, or someone associated somehow with Dick Laurent. We never learn who was there, if there ever was someone there. You're free to interpret it however you want. But the important takeaway is that, for Fred, this is the breaking point. Fred and Renee decide to go to bed, but Fred can't sleep. He goes into his bathroom and looks at himself in the mirror. Whatever you think the shot might mean metaphorically, and we'll get to that topic later, narratively, I view this shot as being the indication in this moment that Fred has decided, once and for all, to kill Renee. In the book Why Does He Do That?, abuse counselor Lundy Bancroft points out a key element of domestic violence that is often misunderstood. He argues that crimes of passion are a narrative used to justify domestic violence, but not to explain it. He argues instead that domestic abusers tightly control their anger and their violent acts, and that they could freely and easily stop themselves from engaging in acts of violence against their partners, but choose to let loose, so to speak, when they feel it to be justified or feel like it will create the outcome they desire. It's not that they reach a breaking point where passion gets the best of them. It's that they reach a point of reasoning within an abusive mindset where they give themselves the right to escalate into violence in order to punish or control their victim. If one were to think of Fred's murder of Renee as a crime of passion, then we wouldn't have this slow build-up to an act of extreme violence. You would think he would become enraged suddenly and without warning, that he would start attacking Renee in an almost animal-like way. But no, instead, he slowly and calmly looks at himself in the mirror. He is contemplating the oncoming act of violence. He walks to bed. We don't see what happens next, but we know. The next day, Fred awakens alone to find the final videotape. The final videotape reveals Fred kneeling over the dismembered and eviscerated corpse of Renee. This is not just an act of jealousy, this is an act of brutal, misogynistic sadism. When looking at acts of violence, we can infer from what type of act has been committed some details about what the assailant was thinking. Killing someone with a gun means something very different from eviscerating someone's body to shreds. So Fred's act is not just one of violent intent, but one of pure hatred. He's not just trying to end her life, he's trying to destroy the object that she represented in his life. I spoke about this topic previously in my video on Twin Peaks. In the pilot episode of that series, Laura Palmer being found wrapped in plastic, creating a disturbing image on TV at the time of a young girl rendered in a completely objectified state. By being an object wrapped in plastic, her body had been reduced to something unrecognizable as human at first. But when her face was revealed in the pilot, the humanity was given back to her. This corpse once was a beautiful young girl. She went from object to subject, from something washed ashore to a girl that had a name, a face, and significance to the denizens of Twin Peaks. The violence against her represented her total objectification, in a literal sense and in the social sense of misogynistic objectification. Women are often treated as objects that serve to benefit men in some way or another. This is particularly common in abuse scenarios, and specifically in domestic abuse. Abusive men will treat their wives and girlfriends as objects in various ways, be it sexual assault, coercing expectations of physical beauty such as encouraging eating disorders or pressuring their partners to dress a certain way, etc. This objectification is something Renee is being exposed to in multiple avenues of life, much like Laura Palmer. Laura was being objectified by sex trafficking, by her family, and by her boyfriend Bobby. Renee is being objectified by Laurent and his pornography ring, but is also being objectified by Fred. This is one of the sad realities of misogyny. That women who are in dire situations when at the hands of abusive or dangerous men often have to escape by cozying up to men who could protect them, who might themselves be abusive or dangerous. Escaping sex trafficking is very difficult to do, and while sex trafficking is not an inevitable conclusion of what's going on with Renee and Lost Highway, it is an inevitable parallel which will be more apparent when we discuss Pete and Alice's story. This brings us back to the story of OJ Simpson and Nicole Brown. Nicole sought partnerships with other men while trying to break free of OJ's controlling and violent grasp. We knew that Nicole feared for her life well prior to her murder, and that if anyone was going to do it, it would be OJ, because he had nearly killed her before. If we don't know this, we will see OJ and Nicole's relationship differently than if we do know it. But the reality of OJ's dangerous, jealous, and violent tendencies towards Nicole are objective facts that were obscured to make him appear innocent. If you accept OJ's history of domestic abuse as a relevant factor in whether or not he killed Nicole, then you have to understand that even if Nicole cheated on OJ or did anything to spite him, this doesn't justify OJ's behaviors towards her. But to the mind of a domestic abuser, it would justify further abuse. Fred has obvious signs of domestic abuse throughout the film, and we know he has violent tendencies and the capacity to kill. We can infer he killed Renee and Dick Laurent, and maybe even killed Andy. But what matters is that we never see definitive proof. There's always a degree of separation that obfuscates this reality in the narrative. The truth of Fred's abuse is revealed in subtle ways in the narrative that force the viewer to have to think for a bit about the implications. We don't see him directly assault Renee ever, but we see a pattern of control and violent jealousy that suggests he would likely do so if he felt it justified. It's the fact that he controls her life, controls her decisions, and is constantly suspicious of her that reveals that he is a selfish, abusive, and misogynistic man. He sees her as an object for his benefit and his alone. And so the old saying goes, if I can't have you, no one can. He takes this to the extreme, not only taking her life as punishment for her infidelity and disrupting his desire for a tightly controlled domestic life, but also destroying her body in an act of brutality that matches his intentions, to reduce her body to a subhuman form, to send a message to himself and to the world, and perhaps in a more spiritual sense, to her, that she is literally nothing without him. His act of murder was an act of misogynistic hatred, born out of the patriarchal mindset that women exist to uphold and benefit the men who seek power over them. She owed him her life, and when she didn't give him it, he took it. It's been a very long time since I made my first video on Lost Highway, but I think I might have said at the time that I view Pete's story as being a fantasy narrative that exists inside of Fred's mind, with Fred's story being the real story and Pete's story being the false story. I don't think this is a bad read of the film, but it's not really how I read Pete's story these days. See, coming to that conclusion requires doing a lot of projecting a more specific narrative onto a film that is intentionally abstract. I've recognized over the years that ambiguity in narratives is not meant to be solved, but rather explored. I don't think Lost Highway is definitively saying Pete is Fred, but rather asking us a question. In what sense are Pete and Fred connected? There's an obvious spiritual connection between them, made literal in the narrative by having Pete take Fred's place. There's also an obvious element of the psychogenic fugue that Lynch talked about wanting to explore with Lost Highway in interviews. But more importantly, they are connected by the very title of the film, Lost Highway. I'll go over the Lost Highway concept in more detail in the later section of the video, but on a base level, the Lost Highway is some kind of spiritual realm that connects Fred and Pete together. We see this in the scene where Pete takes Fred's place. The end of Fred's story, in which he seemingly dies in prison, becomes the start of Pete's story in the runtime of the film. However, this isn't the start of Pete's story altogether. As we see in flashbacks and conversations with people he knows, there's some background to Pete that we're never fully made aware of. Something happened the night that Pete took Fred's place, and that something that happened is part of what connects him to Fred. We'll get to that soon, but not just yet. We see the running shot of a highway from the perspective of the front of a car a few times throughout the film. This is the lost highway of the narrative. It is sometimes a literal highway, and sometimes it seems to be less of a physical place and more of a spiritual or psychological place. And in that spiritual realm, the lost highway never ends, but the car eventually stops. And in the night where Pete takes Fred's place, it stops directly at Pete. It picks him up. Pete has now found himself on the lost highway. This is an important detail in understanding Pete's story. Whatever happened that night, that was the night when Pete became connected to Fred. Let's recap Pete's story chronologically, starting from when he returns from prison. Pete's story begins with him returning to his family life. He lives with his parents and hangs out with punk kids like himself, including his girlfriend Sheila. We learn that Pete works as a mechanic and is the preferred mechanic of a mob boss, Mr. Eddie. Mr. Eddie takes him for a ride to see if his maintenance work is up to snuff, and in the process, Pete watches as Mr. Eddie runs a tailgater off the road and beats him senseless, trying to teach him a lesson about being a safer driver. Pete sees that Mr. Eddie has a strikingly beautiful girlfriend, a woman named Alice. Alice, will come to learn, has some kind of narrative connection to Renee Madison, being played by the same actress and possibly being the same person, though it's never made clear. Alice, without Mr. Eddie's knowledge, goes to the shop where Pete works and asks him out on a date. Pete declines, but finds her charm hard to resist, and they decide to skip the date and go straight to having sex. This starts an affair in which Alice and Pete repeatedly have sex in secret, with Pete hiding this from Sheila and Alice hiding it from Mr. Eddie. Sheila eventually finds out about the affair and, enraged, yells at Pete before finally deciding to break up with him for good. Meanwhile, Alice becomes worried that Mr. Eddie is going to find out, and we see multiple times that Mr. Eddie threatens Pete's life. It seems that Mr. Eddie has found out, but is waiting to catch them in the act, much like Fred is waiting to catch Laurent and Renee in the act to justify killing them. We learn in this section of the story that Mr. Eddie is Dick Laurent, when detectives who are monitoring Pete in secret identify him as such. Alice meets with Pete and tells him that she has a plan for escaping Mr. Eddie. During this conversation, we learn of how Alice got in with the mob in the first place. She was referred to him by a friend who said that there was some secret job that would make her a lot of money, but she wasn't informed of what the job would entail. Alice reveals that when she got there, she was forced at gunpoint to seduce Mr. Eddie. Alice is being held hostage. She doesn't want to be Mr. Eddie's girlfriend, but has been caught up in the mob. It's not explicitly stated that she's a victim of sex trafficking, but her story greatly mirrors that of Laura Palmer, who is being trafficked, and of Dorothy from Blue Velvet, who is being held as a sex slave by a local drug kingpin. This is all within the same general category of sexual exploitation of women by men who threaten their lives in order to obtain complete subservience and prevent them from getting away. When Alice tells Pete her story, Pete seems frustrated or even angry at Alice for letting herself fall in with such bad people. This is a bad sign, which I'll elaborate on in a little bit. Alice conjures up a plan for them to escape together. She'll seduce her friend Andy. Pete has to break in and hide while Alice is busy with Andy, and then knock him out, giving them a window to steal a lot of his expensive belongings, some money, and his car so that they can flee the country together. When they finally enact this plan, it goes less smoothly than they had hoped. Pete accidentally kills Andy and gets a terrible headache. He sees the porn that Alice has produced with Mr. Eddie, and it becomes apparent that he doesn't really understand what he's gotten himself into by being with Alice on any level. Alice pulls a gun on Pete, making it seem as though she's going to betray him and run away by herself. But she was testing Pete to see if Pete trusts her, and she puts down the gun. They drive away together. They go to a cabin in the desert where they're supposed to meet with someone who will help them out. They never meet this person. Instead, Alice and Pete, while waiting for this mystery man to show up, decide to have sex on the desert ground. Alice asks Pete if he wants her. He repeatedly says he does. She says, "You'll never have me," and then gets up and walks away. She never appears again in the film. Pete then turns back into Fred. Now, we have to contemplate this question. Did Alice want to escape with Pete? Did she truly love him, or did she lie to him to get out of a bad situation? And if so, at what point did she devise the plan to betray Pete to free herself from Mr. Eddie? You could argue she had intentions to betray Pete all along. Perhaps instead she didn't ever want to betray Pete and really was just testing him to see if he could trust her with his life. Maybe she wanted him at first but changed her mind. Maybe she wanted him the whole time, but felt she would have to eventually betray him to get away from Mr. Eddie for good. There are many ways of reading her character, but in almost all of them, it is apparent that Alice is deceitful towards Pete, that she knows things that he doesn't, and that she has intentions that don't align exclusively with his. Understanding Pete's story requires understanding that Alice is a more complex character than she seems at first. So let's look at her in a bit more detail. Alice is being held hostage by Mr. Eddie. She doesn't want to be with him and knows from very early on that leaving him would cost her her life. So she can't just leave. She has to figure out a way to escape. Seeing Pete, she sees one of two things. She sees a chance to escape the emotional burden of being held hostage by Mr. Eddie and someone she can be with instead, or she sees a chance to escape the situation on a more literal level, by hatching a plan to get out of town using Pete as part of the process. Regardless, at some point, she devises a plan to escape. Is Pete meant to escape with her, or be set up to be left behind in the process, possibly left to be caught by Mr. Eddie while Alice gets away? The plan needs Pete, and while it puts his life in danger, his life is already in danger by the time they begin having an affair, and he knew from the beginning what he was signing up for, even if he was too naive or immature to recognize that it was a bad idea. Blinded by love, or perhaps by lust, Pete went along with Alice, and she needed him in order to escape her situation. It was a literal survival tactic on her end. Does this absolve her of any moral wrongdoing? Probably not, but it's a complex issue. Her life is on the line with or without Pete. If Pete helps her escape, that would be a good thing for her regardless of the consequences for him. Her manipulation of Pete was a necessary evil for her survival, at which point her actions are not directly comparable to someone like Mr. Eddie, who exploits and uses power solely for his own benefit and out of sadism. Alice may be doing something morally questionable or objectionable, but we have to try to picture it from her perspective. What else could she do? We can mull over possible better options, quote unquote, but she saw the opportunity and she took it because she might not get another one. This is what happens often with people who are held in bad situations. They don't have a lot of windows of escape, and when they do, they often either don't take it out of fear, or on some occasions they do try to take it and it fails and they are severely punished for it. It's possible Alice truly wanted to be with Pete. It's also possible she never wanted him and was just tricking him to get out of the situation with Mr. Eddie. But when her choices are use Pete to escape or die, it's a fundamentally different question to ask why she does what she does. It doesn't matter. What matters is that, given the situation, she has no freedom to make more ethical decisions. I said in the intro for this video that before we can listen to women who are victims of abuse, we have to develop the capacity to do so. The film frames the narrative from Fred's perspective and then from Pete's, but the film doesn't grant Alice and Renee the same subjectivity. We see them secondhand, with 1 degree of separation. As such, it's very easy to see Alice as manipulative and cruel to Pete because we're seeing her through Pete's eyes. But here's my point. Fred and Pete are not a reliable perspective to adopt. We shouldn't trust their perspective, just because it's all we're being exposed to. Just like OJ's perspective distorts our ability to perceive Nicole Brown's reality, we are being conditioned narratively to perceive Renee and Alice through a distorted lens. Alice's moral character is a separate question from her basic dilemma. She could be the most selfish person or the most selfless person, and it would not change that she is being held hostage and does not deserve to be in this state. Really, nobody deserves to be held hostage and forced to have sex with someone at gunpoint. That is sexual assault and domestic abuse. Alice, as a person currently in an extreme domestic abuse situation, has little choice but to do things one might easily perceive as unethical. But this story isn't really about Alice. Part of why it's framed from Pete's perspective is because it's about Pete. In my video on Blue Velvet, I spoke about how Jeffrey Beaumont's voyeuristic interest in Dorothy Valens and desire for her was one that caused him to make decisions that were increasingly exploitative. But as he saw the effects of exploitative behaviors of men on Dorothy's life, he began to see that it was wrong and try to help her escape a bad situation, not so that she could belong to him, but so that she could belong to herself again. Blue Velvet has a bittersweet ending, and the sweet aspect of the ending is that Dorothy is no longer held captive and that Jeffrey Beaumont finds a loving and healthy romance, not with Dorothy, but with Sandy. Both women have their humanity because he treats them as subject and not object. Pete and Alice have some commonalities to the film noir tropes that Blue Velvet commented on. Pete is the unsuspecting, naive, and innocent young man who gets pulled into a life of crime and decay by a beautiful seductress. Alice plays the role of the femme fatale. But like Blue Velvet before, Lost Highway contextualizes the femme fatale as a more sympathetic character, a victim of abuse, violence, and trafficking who is seeking to escape the life of crime that she was coerced into. Alice was naive and innocent like Pete was. She had this robbed from her by Mr. Eddie. Maybe Alice sees something of herself in Pete. Maybe she sees that same innocence and believes that he might understand her enough to help her escape. Sadly, this wouldn't turn out to be the case either way. Pete does not make the same decisions as Jeffrey from Blue Velvet. He makes largely the opposite decisions. He decides to continue having sex with Alice, cheating on his girlfriend Sheila. He had the opportunity to be with Sheila, a loving girlfriend who would not have led him down a dark path. He rejected her and was unfaithful to her, leading to the destruction of his domestic life for the sake of pursuing his new life with Alice. He continues to have sex with Alice rather than refusing to and helping her out anyway. He wants the benefit of her as an object, much like Mr. Eddie. That said, he is not as evil as Mr. Eddie, at least not yet. When Pete learns about Alice's history, Pete doesn't react with sympathy, but with judgment. He's mad at her for being with Mr. Eddie. This is, frankly, just misogyny. She had no choice, but he doesn't see from her perspective, only his own. He can't empathize with her struggle, her pain, or the conundrum she's found herself in. Instead, he just sees her as a beautiful woman that he wants for himself. At this point in the relationship, he knows next to nothing about her. He doesn't know her interests, her passions, her ambitions, much of her history, nothing upon which to form a healthy relationship. Instead, he just knows what she's like in bed. He's exploiting her as an object for his own sexual gratification. He might not see it as such yet, but there are several times where it should be apparent to him that he doesn't have anything to do with her beyond objectification. He doesn't know that she's made porn and is shocked and horrified to find out, which is frankly just a misogynistic instinct when it lacks context and he doesn't even bother to try to talk to her about it to understand her. When she pulls the gun on him, this should be a moment of realization that he really doesn't know anything about her. He doesn't know if he can trust her in this moment because he doesn't know her pretty much at all. She shows by the end of the scene that she trusts him enough to not abandon him or hurt him, suggesting that she understands on some level that there's a person somewhere inside of Pete and not just a free pass for sex. But Pete, with all of these opportunities to realize the mistake he's making and do what Jeffrey did by helping her escape and not attempting to exploit her sexually in the process, he instead continues down the path of viewing her primarily as a body, with little consideration for who she is as a person. This culminates in their final scene together. The two have sex. When Alice says, "You'll never have me," this is framed tonally as a betrayal, as a moment where the beauty of the relationship is destroyed. And in this case, it was her doing. But that was a false beauty, one which Pete was drawn to, a false promise of getting everything he wants via sex with a beautiful woman. I interpret this final line from Alice as indicating that Alice will never belong to Pete. This could be viewed as villainous, but I see it as thematically in line with what we saw of Laura Palmer in Twin Peaks. Laura was being exploited for her body, but Bob wanted something more. He wanted to break her mind. He wanted to destroy her essence, her spirit. And at the end of Fire Walk With Me, we find that that is the one thing that can't be taken from her. She is too strong to be taken to that degree of deprivation. Instead, Bob has to kill her, under that same logic. If I can't have you, no one can. The brutal, total objectification of a woman via murder is, in cases like these, an attempt to show ultimate power over a woman as punishment for her refusal to cooperate and exist solely as an object. Even though it's tragic and there isn't really anything good about the fact that many women are killed in this way, Lynch sees there to be some sort of spiritual good that emanates from the fact that these women do attempt to escape and be free from that sort of cruelty. That these women can't be totally, fully controlled, and their humanity cannot be fully robbed from them, even if their lives can be. I may be a bit more cynical than Lynch in this regard, but I do want to mention another example of this in media. In the movie Mandy, the titular character is drugged by a cult leader who wants to exploit her sexually. He tries to get her to submit her mind to him, to convince her to be a willing sex slave. Despite being drugged to a point of being barely lucid, she manages to laugh in his face. To me, this is a moment where a woman character shows power in the face of a patriarchal circumstance she has found herself forced into. Lost Highway is much the same way. Alice does not belong exclusively to any one man. She is not an object to be exploited. She's a human being. And any man who wants to exploit her to view her as an object for their own sexual gratification, they can certainly try, but they'll never have her the way they want. She does not exist for them. In this moment, Alice is telling Pete that she does not belong to him, that she is not his to exploit. And this is where the seed is planted. The reason this is Pete's last moment in the film is that this is the moment that Pete has become Fred. In other words, Pete has now developed the victim complex mixed with misogynistic entitlement and a desire for selfish personal gratification that makes someone the kind of abuser that Fred and that Mr. Eddie have become. See, Lynch is all about the path that people take to get to where they end up. Lynch explores moral conundrums that people are faced with and what effects the outcomes of those situations have on the people involved. In Twin Peaks, someone's relationship towards Laura Palmer would end up indicating if they were a good person or not. In Blue Velvet, Jeffrey's treatment of Dorothy would end up indicating which path he might go down. Jeffrey was not Frank Booth, but he was becoming like Frank. In Eraserhead, Henry planted a seed of infidelity that grew to the point where he eventually did cheat on his wife. In Blue Velvet, a seed was planted in Jeffrey, but it died. He saw what he was becoming and he stopped it. He changed course. For Lynch, it's not too late until it is, and it becomes too late when someone becomes committed to selfishness, abusiveness, and darkness. For Pete, it was not too late, but in his final moments of screen time, it finally is too late. He didn't set himself on a better path, and instead, he became like Fred. And once the seed has been planted, whatever may happen to Pete now, he is on the lost highway forever. He will never get off that road. He is a lost soul, a man who will internally rot until he ends up in a situation much like Fred or Mr. Eddie. So let's go back. What connects Pete to Fred in the first place? On a literal level, it's the night that Pete took Fred's place. Two things happened that night. One is that Fred seemed to have died from whatever illness he was struggling with in prison. Two is that Pete had a fight with Sheila that seemed to have gotten really bad. The usage of the Lost Highway imagery as a transition here suggests that this moment is when he got picked up, when he had begun to become lost in his ways. Just as Fred exits this world at his lowest point, Pete re-enters the world anew in Fred's place. Fred was on death row. Pete now sees what his life could end up like if he remains in the path that he started on that night when he fought with Sheila. He needs to value the good life he has, but he hungers for something more selfish and destructive. This is revealed to him when he meets Mr. Eddie's girlfriend, Alice. Pete is continuing down a bad path set that night, and it will culminate eventually in his turn away from the light and towards the darkness permanently. Pete's story is a story about how men like Fred and Mr. Eddie are made. They aren't born evil. They lose their way in life as they begin to see the world through an exploitative and destructive lens. Pete will eventually become like Fred, and in the story, he eventually actually becomes Fred. These men are both lost. They have both adopted the patriarchal, misogynistic values that hurt women like Alice, like Renee, like Sheila, like Laura Palmer, like Dorothy Valens, and like so many in our own world. Every reaction Pete has to Alice suggests that he only really cares about himself, even though his actions suggest otherwise. This dissonance is not an accident of the story. It's, to me, the whole point of the story. Pete's story is about Pete becoming lost. His actions represent some degree of desire to help Alice, to benefit her and not just himself. But by the end of the story, the seed will be planted that will turn him away from what good existed within him. He is not a purely evil character, but he is an example of how evil is made, and it's not by a seductive woman. It's by refusing to see women, and people generally, as people, and instead to see them in terms of what can be personally gained by them or not. Pete, Fred, Mr. Eddie, and the Mystery Man all serve similar functions within the narrative when it comes to the role that misogyny plays in patriarchal men. Each one takes on a slightly different role within this. Pete is the naive man who will grow to adopt the hyper-patriarchal beliefs and attitudes that mark Fred and Mr. Eddie. Fred is the failed patriarch who gets revenge on his wife and her lover because of his feeling entitled and emasculated simultaneously. Mr. Eddie, aka Dick Laurent, is the quote-unquote successful patriarch, which indicates the dangers of a patriarchal worldview, given that he's a mob boss who exploits women and holds them hostage for sexual favors. Mr. Eddie is the endpoint of that sort of misogynistic perspective, just as Frank Booth was in Blue Velvet. The Mystery Man will get his own dedicated section because he exists both within and outside the narrative, much like the spirits of Twin Peaks, so I won't go into too much detail here. What matters with the portrayal of all of these men is that they have real-world parallels to some extent. I don't believe that Lynch is commenting on the Mafia so directly. I see the Mafia as more of a Hollywood trope that obscures a more mundane, yet equally harsh reality. See, Lynch was becoming increasingly interested in turning his attention toward Hollywood in his last three films, the so-called LA trilogy, with Lost Highway being the first of the three. While his next two films would be more explicitly about the Hollywood industry, all three films involve an element of the Mafia running entertainment industries while engaging in exploitative practices. In the case of Lost Highway, this is exemplified by Dick Laurent, aka Mr. Eddie, and his role in the production of pornography. Lynch is by no means anti-heterosexual. He certainly has a very complex relationship to heterosexuality, at least his art does, but we've seen positive examples of heterosexuality in Inland Empire and in Twin Peaks: The Return. That said, some of his later works, such as Lost Highway, Dumbland, and Mulholland Drive, take an almost unambiguously bleak view of heterosexuality. But this isn't exactly true. It's heteronormativity that Lynch seems to be most interested in condemning, specifically because of the ways in which it produces misogynistic outcomes. Pete and Alice's story showcases the early stages of how heteronormativity and patriarchal values shape heterosexual romance. Fred and Renee's story showcases the later stages. A story like Pete and Alice is how people become like Fred and Renee. It's the honeymoon phase before the abuse becomes the defining characteristic of the relationship. And once you're in it, it can sometimes feel, and even sometimes be, that there's no way out except to keep spiraling down. As such, Pete's story is tragedy for himself, but not so much for Alice. Who is the Mystery Man? This is a question that could easily spark an endless discussion, but we'll try to keep it more focused. The Mystery Man is a character who functions as a narrative device. Looking back to Twin Peaks, we know that Lynch has, over time, developed a fondness for apparitions and that which is not, or perhaps even cannot be, explained. Bob was some kind of entity, perhaps a ghost, perhaps an alien, perhaps a demon, perhaps just a visual metaphor. But what mattered was Bob's role in the story. Bob existed to simultaneously reveal and obscure the true nature of the killer of Laura Palmer, both to the characters in that show and to the audience. The Mystery Man has a similar function in Lost Highway. He clearly represents some kind of unstated evil, much like Bob. As well, the Mystery Man simultaneously reveals and obscures truths about the characters that he interacts with. The first time we meet the Mystery Man, Fred appears unfamiliar with him, but learns quickly that he's friends with Dick Laurent. The second time we meet him, he's an associate of Mr. Eddie's and calls Pete with a threatening message. The third time we meet him, he is now an associate of Fred's. If you keep company with the Mystery Man, it's obvious that you're not a good person, or at the very least, not on a good path in life. While the story of the film is told out of order, the emotional space in which we experience the narrative of the film is shaped by the order in which we see the Mystery Man. At first, he seems to be hostile to Fred, but by the end, he seems close to him. This is because by the end, we've learned that Fred really did kill Renee and also killed Dick Laurent. We understand by this point that Fred is evil and that he keeps company with evil. At first, the mystery man obscures this reality, but by the end, he reveals it. Throughout my Lynch series, I've used the phrase patriarchy plenty, and I want to reiterate what I mean when I say that. I'm not referring to men. I'm referring to a specific system in which men hold power over women and use that power to exploit women in some form or another. The form of exploitation that patriarchy manifests as can vary, as can the system in question. A system isn't a meaningless aspect of that definition. A system is a series of relationships that can operate as a cohesive whole. An example of a system would be a classroom. In a classroom, one person performs the role of a teacher, and the rest of the classroom are students. Students have less authority and take on less of a role of guiding the studying and learning process. Whether you view this system as good or bad, efficient or inefficient, is up to you. But there are two things that can't be denied. That school classrooms are a system of learning, and that this system of learning more often than not creates differentiated forms of power and authority between different roles. Patriarchy is an ideological influence on the systems that produce patriarchal outcomes. The nuclear family, for example, has traditionally been patriarchal because it has given power to husbands over their wives. This isn't always true, but it's been true often enough historically and is still in many ways true today. Now, the way Lynch has approached patriarchy has usually been very individualized. Particularly in Twin Peaks, we saw patriarchy be localized to a small town and various nuclear families within said town. Lynch has never, say, gone after high-level politics in his stories. Things started to change with Lost Highway, and we saw it grow exceptionally more big picture in his last 3 films and in The Return. Looking ahead to Inland Empire, that film presents a patriarchal dynamic in the Hollywood industry that directly ties it into the Polish mafia. Because Nikki's husband has power over her through his mob ties, she is explicitly, as stated in the film, not free to make choices of her own. She is subject to the desires and whims of her husband. This is an example of patriarchy, but it's an example that situates it within the Hollywood system and not just within an individual family dynamic. Lost Highway concentrates primarily on domestic lives and intimate partnerships. We do see the mafia involved in the story of Lost Highway, but we don't see what connections they have to the world outside. We don't come to learn that Mr. Eddie is working with the cops, like Frank in Blue Velvet, nor do we come to learn that Mr. Eddie has serious ties to the Hollywood industry. That said, we do learn that he produces porn, which could easily tie him into the porn industry. I hope it's uncontroversial to say that the porn industry is very patriarchal and has been since its inception. But I think Lynch was more vague in this film than in his next 2 films about the relationship between the story at hand and the entertainment industry broadly. The Mystery Man strikes me as alluding on some level to the media and Hollywood. It's only with retrospect that it's easy to make these sorts of claims. We can see in the 90s a growing mainstream of conspiracy theory movies. I've mentioned Fight Club and The Matrix as examples time and time again, but in this case, the more appropriate film to mention is Eyes Wide Shut. Eyes Wide Shut has been, for a lot of people, the definitive proof film about there being some sort of shady goings-on among the cultural elite. For some, this fits into far-right conspiracy theories such as the Illuminati, but even someone who doesn't believe such fringe conspiracies would have a hard time not feeling like Eyes Wide Shut is saying something about the behind-the-scenes reality of the rich and the cultural elite. We also know that Kubrick was highly averse to Hollywood and spoke poorly of people with power generally, warning his children to stay away from anyone with serious power. Whatever kinds of things Kubrick saw or knew about, we can't really know for certain. But we do see similar whispers emerging in Lynch's art. Mulholland Drive comments quite directly on the Hollywood industry, and I've always had this vague feeling that The Return predicted the sorts of realities of what we would end up seeing during the Me Too movement. Jeffrey Epstein, for example, was an open secret within Hollywood for a long time, as was Harvey Weinstein, as were Bryan Singer and Kevin Spacey. There had been whispers, but nothing more than that. Perhaps it was dangerous for job security to call these people out directly. Perhaps they risked lawsuits or even worse consequences for speaking out. Maybe they didn't have any true confirmation to go off of and couldn't speak out on rumors alone. Regardless of the reason, we can only speculate about what people knew at the time. That said, we knew a lot about the OJ Simpson trial, and we now know a lot about the corruption within the Hollywood industry and how ingrained patriarchal systems are within it. To me, The Mystery Man ties these two realities together in an interesting way. Behind OJ were a team of men whose role was to protect OJ from serious jail time. The same was true for Jeffrey Epstein. He had a team of men and even women to help protect him and secure him a position of power over various women and girls. We didn't always see these people. We certainly didn't see them prior to the exposure of the named men in question, but they were always there. And within their stories was not just a truth of individual exploitation, but a system of exploitation. Epstein set up a system to exploit girls, and OJ used his fame and wealth to escape jail time by burying the realities of his abuse and violent tendencies and obfuscating the narrative. This was not just a result of media, but the result of specific people performing specific roles to help maintain power for the people they worked for. The Mystery Man, to me, represents those faceless others who help uphold the faces who have power. If Fred is an analog for OJ, then the Mystery Man is an analog for Robert Kardashian, Johnny Cochran, Robert Shapiro, Al Cowlings, and many, many other people involved in making it so that OJ would get away with murder. But on a more abstract level, he represents the people behind the scenes who work to allow corruption and exploitation of others to happen. He represents the people who help clean up blood, who attempt to silence victims or prevent them from speaking out, etc. He is an embodiment of a specific kind of evil, which is the evil of systems of power within Hollywood and within the spheres of the rich and famous. We can understand this within the narrative of the film. He works for Dick Laurent, a literal mob boss who is also a porn producer. We understand that the Mystery Man, then, has ties to the mafia. But he also has ties to Fred, a successful musician living in LA, tying him to at least the local music scene. Though given Fred's considerable wealth, the scale might be a bit bigger than just local. But it's specifically the Mystery Man's role in the narrative that is most interesting. He exists to obfuscate the reality of violence of the men around him. We see that he is the one who shoots Dick Laurent. Since the Mystery Man is ambiguous if he's meant as real or not within the film, it obfuscates, for us, whether or not Fred killed Dick or is merely an accomplice to the murder. That same obfuscation is what the Mystery Man does for Fred's murder of Renee. We don't actually see Fred murder Renee. As far as we know, it's entirely possible that the Mystery Man murdered Renee or some third person, and that Fred happened upon her mangled corpse and had some sort of mental breakdown, getting caught, so to speak. Entertaining that perspective feels pointless given that the film is clearly trying to frame Fred as the murderer of Renee and Dick both. But the ambiguity is the point. Because we can't know for certain, we're left in the dark. This is what the Mystery Man does. He obfuscates the reality of violence and abuse to the viewer. This doesn't mean that he ultimately allows Fred to go free. We do see that Fred goes to prison for killing Renee. But in a meta sense, the Mystery Man gives Fred a degree of plausible deniability in such a way that it forces the viewer to have to think for ourselves about what we believe. I think most people who view the film will take away that Fred murdered Renee and Dick Laurent both. But we have to overcome the narrative ambiguity to make that call, and I think Lynch wants us to face this ambiguity as it is, for the same reason we had to face that ambiguity when it came to OJ, because we weren't there. I said in the intro to this video that the realities of domestic abuse can be revealed without having to hear from the victim necessarily. In cases of murder victims, we can see trends that indicate that domestic abuse would be the cause for their murder. But while this is something that bears out statistically, narrative control plays a very significant role in domestic abuse. Narrative control also plays a significant role in most patriarchal abuse. Patriarchy is itself a form of narrative control, by creating a cultural expectation that allows men power and denies it to women. This is why when men in Hollywood were sued for sexual assault, historically they often settled out of court prior to the Me Too movement, because hush money functions as narrative control. It allows the victim some amount of consolation so that they won't speak out, but also allows the famous men in question to continue to have fame, money, freedom, and potentially a position to further exploit women in similar ways going forward. It's all tied up within a system, and those systems do not work without people involved beyond the individual assailant and individual victims, the middlemen of exploitation. The Mystery Man is that middleman. The Mystery Man also functions, to an extent, as an analog of the viewer in the OJ Simpson case, or rather, the watchful eye of the camera that helped broadcast the story into all of our living rooms. If the mystery man is a middleman for exploitation, then his role as a voyeur in Fred's life also implicates the media as helping to make exploitation possible. This makes sense when you consider how much the public spectacle of the OJ trial influenced the verdict. The invasion of the private lives of OJ and Nicole Brown meant that the story was no longer about the actual murder itself and became a broader cultural conversation. And the media profited off of promoting the narratives that helped to further obfuscate whether or not OJ was guilty. As I said in the beginning of this video, the cultural narratives surrounding OJ created two socially constructed images of who he was, neither of which can be verified to be true, but both of which impacted how people perceived the real man. These two versions, innocent and guilty OJ, were narratives that were largely influenced by the role that media played. If we didn't have the media to intrude on the case in question, it would be much more likely that OJ would be found guilty. So in that sense, the impact that the public eye had on the verdict aided him in a similar manner to his own team. This is where the abstraction of the mystery man leads me. His role in the story, in Fred's life, is to help make Fred's cruel intents manifest, but he embodies a sort of spiritual sickness that is more than just individual, and it's apparent that he keeps company with anyone on a path of wickedness. We'll address this more in the next section, but I do want to take some time to point out the usage of technology as it pertains to the mystery man. I got some jazz for talking so much about technology in my old videos on Lynch, which is fair, but to my credit, I was a teenager when I made those videos and had very little experience writing scripts. What I really meant when I said technology was more specifically modern technology and its role in shaping our daily lives. Lynch explored the theme of electricity in Fire Walk With Me and The Return, and in those works, electricity was a natural force, being harnessed by humans for our own purposes. And while electricity was, in isolation, a neutral element, it gained either constructive or destructive properties depending on how it was used. The same is true of the technology that has been afforded to us by electricity. Cars can be used constructively or destructively, as can phones or video cameras. But in Lost Highway, we primarily see how these are used as destructive forces. The mystery man is always tied in some substantial way to technology, but it's not just any technology. It's specifically the technologies that create a system like what we see in Hollywood: phones and video cameras. Phones make the calls that make films happen. Cameras are how films are captured in the first place. The two are necessary components of the Hollywood industry. The mystery man is rarely seen without one of those two pieces of technology. First, he uses a cell phone, which somehow allows him to be in two places at once. This is interesting because that is what phones do. They allow you to be on the speaking end in your physical location, while having a conversation on the receiving end in someone else's location, creating a second self temporarily through electricity that manifests on the receiving end of the line. This ability in our world is portrayed as a metaphor in Lost Highway that demonstrates how the usage of phones gives the mystery man, and people like him, serious power that can be used, in this case, for ill. We see him using a phone again when he talks to Pete and threatens his life. Then we see him with a video camera stalking Fred, and it's revealed that he had been the one stalking Fred and Renee all this time. Finally, we see him with some sort of playback device that he gives to Dick Laurent before killing him, which shows the porn that Laurent produced. The reason he's always seen with this tech is because, like the decaying infrastructure of the road industry in Twin Peaks, these technologies are what allow him to manifest. Thinking purely on metaphorical terms, the reason we even have systems of exploitation in the entertainment industries is because we have the modern technology to allow it. Porn could not be produced without cameras. Modern movie productions could not involve so many people, make so much money, and have such significant production values without phone calls. Phones and cameras are neutral. It's how you use them. But Hollywood has, historically, used them often for ill, resulting in circumstances like Weinstein, Epstein, and most relevant, OJ Simpson. It's unavoidable that the trial being televised altered the way in which the trial was conducted and may have even altered its outcome. Technology fundamentally shaped the OJ story, and thus fundamentally shaped the potential for justice that Nicole Brown might have had things gone differently. The modern technologies at the time of the production of Lost Highway that gave life to the movie itself also gave life to exploitative and harmful practices. Patriarchy is given power through the technologies of industry. The mystery man reveals the consequences of the usage of these modern technologies for ill. The point here isn't that this is what phones and cameras have done to us, it's This is how cruelty has been shaped by the usage of phones and cameras. Going back again to Blue Velvet, that film set a precedent for the themes of most of Lynch's original works from that point onward. That hunger for more can generate spiritual rot, and that if we want to live fulfilling lives, we need to learn to be happy with who we have in our lives and seek goodness, compassion, and general well-being for ourselves and others. Exploitation breeds violence, death, and destruction, and we have to end exploitation and the values that support it in order to find true happiness. This carries throughout his works, and in Lost Highway, this manifests in the form of a case study on domestic violence within the entertainment industry and the culture of Los Angeles. Fred should be happy to be with Renee, or else end the relationship and seek a more fulfilling and healthy relationship with someone who he will be happy with. But entitlement and resentment generate within him a desire for retribution, which turns to violence, which turns quickly to murder. This is how the spiritual rot of Los Angeles has influenced him. The mystery man doesn't just reveal Fred's inner evil, he brings it out of him. He helps bring out vindictiveness, jealousy, and paranoia. This is what patriarchal dynamics do to men within them. They create this sense that men can't trust anyone, not the women in their lives, nor the men. It creates unnecessary and often unjustified anger. It makes people act worse. It makes them be worse. Fred is lost, in part, because he belongs to a world which fosters being spiritually unwell as a man of considerable fortune. The reason there's no hope for him is because there's no hope for the social circles that he's immersed in. He's immersed in sleaze, violence, and exploitation. He becomes like the others. He is a passenger in a car on a lost highway. In Blue Velvet, Lynch touched on the theme of voyeurism by having Jeffrey hide in a closet and watch Dorothy Valens in her home without her knowledge. Lynch forced us into Jeffrey's point of view to comment on the misogyny inherent to a voyeuristic perspective, reinforced not just in cultural norms, but in media also. Twin Peaks expanded on this theme by presenting a murder victim as the object of voyeuristic obsession. By roping viewers into the show with the hook of a homecoming queen found dead and wrapped in plastic, Lynch used the typical misogynistic voyeurism that had been so normalized in American culture to tell a story about its consequences on Laura Palmer herself. He expanded these themes into Fire Walk With Me by giving humanity back to the Laura Palmer character through showing her life and how she was affected by the cruelty she had been subjected to, both prior to and through her murder. Life would imitate art not long after the release of Fire Walk With Me, when Nicole Brown was found dead. Nicole Brown was, in many respects, a real-world Laura Palmer, and the trial of the century had reinforced all of the same voyeuristic tendencies that Lynch had been trying to undermine in his prior works. Lost Highway reflects on this cultural shift that the OJ trial signified by making explicit the role that technology plays in the normalization of misogyny and voyeurism. The videotapes that the Madisons find on their porch are revealed to be footage stalking Fred and Renee as they sleep. The way in which the video camera violates their privacy to film them in their most intimate moments, while unaware, mimics the very same filmmaking of the closet scene in Blue Velvet. We are put into the perspective of the voyeur, only this time, the camera's perspective is also diegetic, showing them through an actual camera. While the misogyny Lynch comments on long predates his movies, Lost Highway is in many ways an update on how misogyny has changed in the late 20th century with the rise of mass media and an increasing emphasis on more advanced technology. This is part of why Lost Highway places such a heavy emphasis on pornography. In the late 20th century, porn represented a lot of the worst of how misogyny has come to manifest in the technological era. Certainly with the rise of the internet, the role that porn would play in the average life would only increase. But Lynch uses porn not only reflexively, but also as an example that demonstrates the broader cultural shifts around it. As technology becomes more advanced, the method through which patriarchy transforms women into objects has become more advanced with it. Porn embodies, in particular, the growing voyeuristic obsession with women that Lynch had been making note of since at least Blue Velvet. The fact that the videotapes that arrive at the Madisons' residence are assumed to be porn before being revealed to be stalking footage is apt. The stalking footage is basically porn all the same. It's a man seeking pleasure in the objectification of a couple in their intimate moments. Because they replicate the same mentality, the distinction between them collapses. There's something very wrong about viewing someone in a vulnerable moment without their consent, and yet we started to see since the 90s, time and time again, that the public will consume this kind of media ravenously. In the digital age, media has conditioned us to have an increasingly sick relationship to real-world people, to view them increasingly as objects in a spectacle for our amusement. Celebrity culture objectifies the celebrity, but also conditions us to view their lives as hyper-real. The OJ trial embodied this hyper-reality by showing a real-life murder and convincing us to detach from its reality and view it through the lens of spectacle. This is how modern media promotes a voyeuristic worldview. Voyeurism is a largely parasitic dynamic, and that parasitism is the through line with most forms of misogyny, and particularly the forms of misogyny that Lynch comments on in his work. In Lost Highway, the mystery man functions in part as a stand-in for the viewer. The viewer of this film, of films in general, of porn, and most importantly, of the OJ trial. The mystery man is that hypothetical audience member who went too far in their obsession with a real person. He's also an embodiment of the spiritual sickness itself. When we create a misogynistic cultural landscape and use these modern technologies to promote it, we generate a darkness that resembles and comes to be represented by the mystery man. He embodies the spirit of misogyny and exploitation in Hollywood. I mentioned before how he embodies this in the behind the scenes of Hollywood, but as we look through his eyes in the videotape scenes, he also comes to embody this in the forefront of Hollywood and the entertainment industry. Media conditions us to think in a sick, objectifying manner. Media does the objectification for us, and we passively accept it as reality. Common in media criticism is the concept of the male gaze. I have my issues with the term, but I think the core idea of the male gaze is rooted in something that is a serious problem in how media is made. Men tend to hold the authorial power of films, and men tend to frame things from the perspective of men for the sake of other men. It's this expected relationship with the audience that is more important than the actual identities of those doing the filming. This means that, in the conversation that film creates between filmmakers and audiences, women are often kept only as listeners and rarely as speakers. This doesn't mean women have no power in filmmaking or as audience members, far from it. But it does mean that women have to do work to contend with the male gaze in a way that men won't be expected to. And the male gaze is, in many ways, quasi-pornographic. It views women not just as objects, but as sex objects. And this sexual objectification is viewed as almost ideal, as though the best way to be a woman is to be sexually attractive to the audience. This voyeuristic mentality is heavily what Lost Highway is speaking out against. See, the videotapes function as foreshadowing on multiple levels. First, the videotapes foreshadow the eventual murder of Renee by Fred. They imply that the home is unsafe and that something isn't right. But more importantly, the videotapes present the male gaze to the audience as foreshadowing for a problem that won't become fully evident until the third act of the film. So let's talk, again, about Alice. Alice is the embodiment of the ideal feminine. She is, in this film, the equivalent not just to Dorothy Valens or Laura Palmer, but also the lady in the radiator in Eraserhead. The lady in the radiator was a construct of Henry's mind that presented herself as everything Henry could want in a woman. In a surrealist sort of way, she was pretty, talented, endlessly adoring of him, and she was incapable of getting pregnant, implying a sexual dimension to her value in Henry's eyes. Alice begins in Pete's story as a similarly ideal woman. She's beautiful, well-dressed, sexual, and irresistibly attracted to Pete. But as we come to learn through her story, she's a human, someone who has experienced serious hardship and abuse and is trying to find her way out of a life-threatening situation any way she can. Pete continues to view Alice primarily as an object for himself. He wants her body, he wants her sex, her loyalty, and all of her time. He gazes at her as if he's in love, but he ultimately just finds her sexually attractive. He doesn't know anything about her, and this is continually reinforced throughout their story as he finds that he knows so little about who she even is. Pete is a voyeur, but his voyeurism is disguised through the usage of the male gaze in the filming. His gaze upon her is framed as romantic, her body framed as irresistibly beautiful, but it's ultimately objectifying, and he clearly shows signs of viewing Alice as just a sex object. When Alice recounts her story of meeting Mr. Eddie, she's being forced at gunpoint to have sex with him, but the film frames the scene from a perspective that I interpreted as being Pete's. He pictures her as ultimately enjoying the thrill of being forced into sex, thus reframing an act of sexual assault and abuse into an act of willing participation in a woman's own objectification. This is how the male gaze damages men's view of women. By viewing them as objects, it reframes their actions as desiring their own objectification. Pete asks why Alice didn't just leave, but then argues that she must have liked it. But this clearly ignores the fact that she had no choice to leave. Much like Blue Velvet, there's a lesson to be learned. Sure, women can be beautiful, and that can be something to admire, but you have to treat them as human beings and not just as objects for your own pleasure. When Pete sees Alice on screen in the porn that she produced with Mr. Eddie, Pete ironically sees his own sexual obsession with her reflected back to him. This image shouldn't be disturbing to him, but it is, because he feels entitled to her and resents her for being an object available to other men, rather than viewing her situation as what it is, effectively being held hostage by Mr. Eddie. It's the virgin horror dichotomy, just like with Laura Palmer. Pete either sees her as pure and innocent or as whorish. Pete even sees an extremely whorish version of Alice mocking him according to the screenplay. This is Pete's worst fear, that the object of his obsession is an object that doesn't belong solely to him. There's an interesting filmmaking trick that happens. Lynch continually uses POV shots to show Fred and Pete's perspective. In the scene where Pete attempts to wash up and sees the whorish version of Alice, we see the framing from a first-person perspective. We then see this exact scene mimicked with the scene in which Fred ambushes Dick Laurent after he sleeps with Renee. The implication is clear that by viewing these women as whorish, these men have taken on the same visual language as the videotapes. They've become stalker-like. While Pete's scene is surreal, it exists to foreshadow the same ugly truth that presents itself in Fred's assault of Laurent: possessiveness and hatred of the women that they seek sex from. The POV shots use the perspective of the male gaze to collapse the distinction between them. What Fred, Pete, and the Mystery Man are doing are all born of the same possessive attitude towards women that creates abuse, violence, and destruction. Pete fails to understand the problem with how he views Alice, and this is why, at the end of their story, Alice says he'll never have her, because she's more than her body. It's reminiscent of the ending of Fire Walk With Me, in which Laura reclaimed her spirit in the face of Bob's attempt to rob everything from her. Pete may seem like a victim in this moment, but when we see Pete transform back into the murderer Fred, it's easy to call this perspective into question. The male gaze, voyeurism, and general misogynistic objectification all form a relationship with one another that is being explored in Lost Highway. We see Pete view Alice similarly to how the Mystery Man viewed Fred and Renee, as an object for the pleasure of the viewer. Media allows this sort of misogyny to invade our homes, through our TVs, and into our minds through the silver screen. Media encourages voyeurism and misogyny by framing everything from a male perspective in such a way that dehumanizes the women who end up as topics of interest. When Pete turns back into Fred, Pete's story gets turned back around onto himself as Fred when the Mystery Man reveals that Alice is really Renee and that he was the one stalking them both for so long. The Mystery Man seems to be, in part, actually a part of Fred. It's the violent, aggressive, vindictive part, and by extension, the misogynistic part of Fred. Fred's misogyny manifests the invasion of his home and the stalking of Renee. Fred himself stalks Renee, attacks her lover, and then later kills her too. Fred is the ultimate misogynist, and Pete turning into Fred reveals that the same seed of misogyny that caused Pete to view Alice as an object to lust after is the same that produced the videotapes that we saw at the beginning of the film, and that will ultimately result in Renee's murder. Abuse stems from a dehumanizing attitude towards the victims. Misogyny plays a large role in shaping this dehumanizing attitude in men, and this misogyny is shaped by culture, by media, for profit, and for ratings. Alice and Renee are porn actresses, but even this is framed sympathetically. Porn actresses are typically the group most likely to be viewed as okay to objectify, but Lost Highway still manages to challenge this notion, and it does so in a way that suggests that the objectification of women in porn is really just an extension of the misogyny that's present at all levels of the entertainment industry and in American culture generally. Misogyny sells, but it's a purely destructive force. The usage of modern technology to exploit women has made it increasingly destructive. And whereas Fred and Pete both failed to kill those parts of themselves that view women as sex objects, the moral of Lost Highway is that if we want to live in a better world, we have to kill this part of ourselves and our society that seeks voyeuristic pleasure in the suffering and objectification of women. I've discussed the Lost Highway concept in previous sections of this video, but I want to close out this deep dive into Lost Highway by looking into its namesake more thoroughly. The Lost Highway is never explicitly stated as a destination or a concept in the film. There's a Lost Highway hotel that Fred finds Renee and Dick Laurent at, but otherwise there aren't any mentions of a Lost Highway. It's obvious though from watching the film that the Lost Highway is a visual metaphor, first shown in the opening credits of the film, and that comes back into play at various points in the story. So what is the Lost Highway? Well, it's a metaphor for spiritual crisis, effectively. Getting on the Lost Highway means that you're becoming lost in your ways, succumbing to the evils of the world and risking becoming evil yourself. In other words, it's the highway to hell. The usage of a highway in the visual is important for a number of reasons. First, it's a convenient way of conveying the information of becoming lost. When people get on a highway, they typically drive in one direction for long periods of time until they eventually get to their destination. Highways can be dangerous. You can die in a collision or have your car veer off the road. So the longer you're on a road, the more you risk a potential disaster. In Lost Highway, the visual of the highway symbolizes a never-ending journey into spiritual destruction. The highway concept also serves as a good metaphor for abuse and what abusive dynamics entail. When you enter into an abusive relationship, as the abuser or the abuse victim, you end up in a situation where the more the relationship goes on, the more stuck down a bad path the relationship becomes. The abuser in this dynamic is like a driver who at any moment could kill both of them with their driving, and the victim is just a passenger, doomed to whatever destination the driver chooses for them. To get off the highway in both of these reads of the concept would be to make a change for the better, to stop being cruel and abusive, or for those who are being abused, to try to break free from the abuse. If we look back at Fire Walk With Me and the Twin Peaks series generally, it's apparent that Lynch connects spirituality to modern-day technologies, and in particular, those associated with cars and the road industry. So to use cars as a metaphor for spirituality in Lost Highway feels like it comes from the same perspective. In the Twin Peaks franchise, cars were part of how colonization impacted America, including indigenous people, colonizers, and the environment itself. The exploitation of nature that built the modern infrastructure of America was causing a spiritual sickness that was birthing apparitions that wished ill on the world. It's fitting that the Mystery Man's apparent place of residence is a cabin on the Lost Highway. He has made a home in the endless darkness of the evils of man. Whether he manifested from the highway or just found residence alongside it isn't ever made clear. But what is clear is that cars, like videotapes or phones, are used for similar evils in the film. Mr. Eddie almost kills a man by ramming his car off the road. Fred uses his car to kidnap Dick Laurent and take him out into the desert so that he can kill him without getting caught. Pete's role as a mechanic, although good-intentioned, ends up getting him caught up in the evils of the mob just the same as Alice before him. Cars are not fundamentally evil. It's how they're used. But cars afford people a great deal of power while also requiring a lot of responsibility. The Lost Highway metaphor connects the literal power that cars afford people with the spiritual power that cars have on people. If people become cruel, cars become a weapon. Of course, the Lost Highway metaphor can't be discussed without mentioning how it relates to the OJ Simpson case. OJ famously drove his car for over an hour down the 405 freeway while in a low-speed pursuit with the police. OJ wasn't actually the driver, but was instead in the back with a gun, threatening his own life. OJ ultimately had the power, but it was the image and the effect that it had on the American public that's most important. The white Bronco traveling down the highway showed the world a man both in his most vulnerable state and most powerful state. He was powerful because he was rich, famous, and had the attention of the world in that moment. He could say whatever he wanted and people would listen. He could do whatever he wanted and people would watch. But he was vulnerable because he was claiming to be suicidal. He was wanted for the murder of his wife, and at the time, it appeared that he might be innocent. That dichotomy revealed how much the image of a car driving down a highway factored into social and personal dynamics in America in an interesting way. But the OJ chase had a long-term effect worth noting. See, the chase changes meaning depending on if you think that OJ was innocent or guilty. If he was guilty, his fleeing would not only be proof of guilt, but also a sense of remorselessness about his actions. He wanted to avoid jail because he wanted to get away with the murder. The car chase not only prevented his arrest for an hour or so, but also put pressure from the public eye to treat his case more delicately than they would have otherwise. If he was guilty, the chase was part of his manipulation that let him free. If, on the other hand, you viewed him to be innocent, then his fleeing would be justified as an emotional outburst in the face of an uncertain trial ahead of him. He knew he was a suspect, and he might get taken to court over this, so his actions can be framed in a more sympathetic light if you really think he didn't kill his ex-wife. Regardless, when he was on that seemingly never-ending car ride, so were we. We were alongside him, taking a journey to hell. And when it finally stopped, the ride never really stopped for us. We followed him into the trial, into the acquittal, and then continued to fixate on him in pop culture for decades after. We never got out of the car. This is another sense in which The Lost Highway implies a sense of being lost. It's a more existential lost, one which puts us all at risk. When Fred becomes Pete, it happens with a brief scene in which we see the car on the Lost Highway slow down and stop at the side of the road to pick up Pete. Pete gets onto the Lost Highway. He is becoming lost. What connects Fred and Pete is not just the particulars of their story, but the existential concerns that permeate their lives. Anyone can become lost in their ways. Anyone can become cruel, selfish, or destructive. Anyone can find themselves on the Lost Highway. Pete finds himself on the Lost Highway at that moment in time because Fred's death becomes a second chance for Pete. Fred is, to some extent, a warning story about where Pete could end up if he continues down the path he's chosen in life. But Pete will fail to course correct. He'll find himself lost forever, just like Fred. The OJ trial demonstrated that we all have some amount of darkness in ourselves that compel us to obsession. This obsession is to an extent projection, but it's also just a reflection of our own uncertainty about our place in the world. OJ's place in the world seemed more secure before the murder. He seemed to have everything a guy could want. So if he killed his wife, this, for a lot of people, would have broken the myth of the American dream that OJ represented. If you can have it all, but that's still not enough, then what does that mean for the rest of us who don't have it all, and who want a lot of the things that OJ and those like him have? Having it all, materially or socially, does nothing to heal oneself spiritually. We have to do good for the world, for ourselves and others. We have to feel the effects of the world getting better by helping make the world better. And if we don't, then we find ourselves confused and lost. That loss and confusion, I think, is a large part of why people become fascinated by cases like OJ in the first place. I think it's partly inevitable. Because OJ was such an extreme case, everyone was going to be interested at least a bit. But OJ's case revealed ugly truths about our world that media didn't want us to think about, and that we probably didn't want to think that much about ourselves. Lost Highway takes those uncomfortable truths and presents them in the metaphor of the Lost Highway itself. We are always just a stone's throw away from becoming existentially and spiritually lost. And we have opportunities to course correct, to get off the path we found ourselves on and find a better path in life. But we have to recognize this possibility and actualize it before it's too late. Otherwise, people become like Fred, like Pete, like Mr. Eddie, or more sympathetically, like Alice and Renee. When detectives investigate the crime scene at Andy's house, they see a picture of Andy and Dick Laurent with Renee. Alice, who had appeared in the photo earlier, is mysteriously missing. It's as if she was never there. It's hard not to think of the invisibility of victims even when hypervisible. Ways in which people like Nicole Brown were silenced, had their stories overwritten by the gaze of others, or had their lives robbed from them, spiritually and even physically. It's a disturbing feature of our world that we often allow to fade into the background or else make a hyperreal spectacle of. For many people, it's a reality that directly impacts their lives. If you don't know someone who has been a domestic abuser or a victim of domestic abuse at some point in your life, that'd be fairly shocking. But one of the main issues with domestic abuse is how it presupposes an object-based framing. That if you are abused, you are an object upon which abuse occurred. The subjective experience of abuse is one of the more difficult parts for people to comprehend if they haven't been through it themselves. In a lot of ways, it can feel as though abuse made it so that you were never there, so that you never had feelings, thoughts, complex relationships to and understanding of your own abuse. And this is especially true of abuse victims who eventually die or are killed as a consequence of the abuse. It's a really heavy topic to handle, and it's hard in a unique way to handle the topic of abuse of another person. To talk about Nicole Brown at all feels difficult because then I'm creating a piece of media which further contributes to a pool of narratives that have collectively continued to treat her as a spectacle. There's real danger in these sorts of narratives, and demystifying is a start, but it's not easy to do. I attempted to do my best to demystify the story of OJ and Nicole Brown. There's what we can know, what we can't know, and what we should try to understand in the face of limited knowledge. We don't live in the world where Nicole wasn't murdered, where OJ wasn't put on trial for the murder, and where he wasn't acquitted. The spectacle of her death has become an unavoidable piece of pop culture. Lynch's obsession with the OJ trial inspired him to make Lost Highway, but Lost Highway isn't about OJ and Nicole. It's about a deeper spiritual issue in our world that the OJ trial exposed to a wider audience, an issue of intense misogyny. Misogyny is Lynch's point of focus in a lot of his work, but misogyny isn't the root of the problem. It's just a particular point of interest for Lynch. The problem, more broadly, is an attitude of exploitation, hatred, and lack of compassion for others. Men are the victims of this too in the world and in Lynch's work, but the gendered component of misogyny is a consistent through line of most of Lynch's original works, and that's no different here. It took me a long time to get around to making this video about Lost Highway. There were a lot of behind-the-scenes reasons for it, but when it comes to Lynch's movies, Lost Highway is one of the more difficult films to talk about because it's when he first started to move back towards the more abstract storytelling of his very early days. Because of this, a lot of the themes of Lost Highway are vague because the story interacts with more postmodern forms of storytelling in ways that are harder to make sense of. I could easily spend more time talking, for example, about how the film feels almost like a parody of crime films of the 80s and 90s, much the way that Blue Velvet is a genre critique of film noir. I could talk about how Lost Highway's ideas were remixed in Mulholland Drive, Inland Empire and The Return, or go into excruciating detail about individual elements of the movie. But unlike Twin Peaks, which continued to develop a mythos and relationships to characters over the course of 3 seasons in a movie, Lost Highway as a singular, isolated piece has less to refer to clarify a lot of its meaning. But the overarching theme of Lost Highway is really not that distinct from Fire Walk With Me or Blue Velvet before it, which makes it a bit difficult to talk about because I don't want to sound redundant. I want to give each work their own unique dissection. And with Lost Highway, I think what really separates it from prior works in Lynch's filmography is how it plays on the, at the time, very recent cultural memories of the OJ Simpson trial to comment on what has changed in the world within those ensuing years. See, Blue Velvet was meant to take place in the 50s or early 60s, or at least feel like a film from that era. Twin Peaks intentionally used the backwards small-town cliché to transport us to a world that was reminiscent of the 50s. Lynch is often going back to the 50s and 60s for inspiration aesthetically, but also thematically. Lost Highway has some of that old school style, but far less of it than anything Lynch has made before or since. Lost Highway feels pretty firmly planted in the 80s and 90s, and this is most evident with the usage of music, with contemporary genres like industrial, trip-hop, and electronic music being significant choices for the soundtrack. Lost Highway being a more 90s take on Lynch's themes, I think helps substantiate the connections to OJ. See, music of an era does not just evoke the time period or the pop culture of an era, it also evokes the daily lives of what people were experiencing. Lynch is fairly deliberate with his music choice, as he's pulling often from the cultural history of America, and in this case, Lost Highway pulls from a more recent history. I remember for a time feeling like that made Lost Highway feel more dated because of using songs from contemporary artists like Rammstein and Nine Inch Nails rather than timeless classics. But I don't really feel that way anymore. Instead, I feel like the spirit of Lost Highway is best conveyed with the music chosen. Lost Highway is a film that is a descent into hell, and what better soundtrack could accompany it than the most hellish music of its time? To me, the central piece of what makes Lost Highway distinct in Lynch's catalog is that it explores domestic abuse in the most direct way of any of his works so far. He would explore domestic abuse most directly in Dumbland, which I'll cover later in this series, and also explore it further in Inland Empire and The Return. But here in Lost Highway, it starts to become apparent that Lynch isn't so much a storyteller as he is a man with a very specific philosophy, and he creates art to continually update this philosophy to what stories need to be told at the time. Lynch eventually went dormant on filmmaking for a while and switched to mostly focusing on paintings for a number of years. During that time, we see the re-emerging themes of broken homes, broken minds, and broken spirits in his paintings. I think Lynch believes that nobody has to become lost. But he laments how many people do fall down bad paths, or worse yet, choose bad paths for themselves. And this is just as true for women as it is for men. It's just that, at least in Lynch's stories and what we do tend to see in the world, the bad paths are shaped by patriarchal norms in our society, such that women often end up as victims, and men often as perpetrators. But men are victims too, and everyone is ultimately a victim of a world that values capital and power over human life and equity. Lynch watched the world, at least in America, get worse in a lot of ways after Reagan took over and undermined decades of progress. But Reagan left a project that has since been taken on by the entire political sphere in America and has led to a massive cultural shift that in many ways normalized humanity's worst tendencies instead of its best. It didn't have to be this way, but the tragedy of America since the 80s has been cataloged in Lynch's work in various ways, and Lost Highway is the definitive 90s venture into Lynch's themes. But unlike Blue Velvet and Fire Walk With Me, which present hope, Lost Highway presents no hope. In this sense, Lost Highway is his darkest film. If you live a cruel life, you experience a meaningless death. Your spirit simply perishes with your body, like Frank, like Fred, and like a few characters we will see in upcoming Lynch works. The tragedy of abuse is that it never had to be that way. And that's the tragedy of the American norm in the age of mass media and deregulated post-Reagan capitalism. It doesn't have to be this way. But the darkness that marks the worst of us has entered into our homes, through the walls, into our TVs, and into our minds. We have become immersed in the spiritual decay of a world ravaged by bad faith actors with significant power. Lost Highway started to explore these themes, but it was only a start. We'll see how deep the rabbit hole goes for Lynch's work from here. In the next video, we'll discuss a lot of these themes and more when we tackle Lynch's most acclaimed work, Mulholland Drive. Stay tuned.